Hello, and welcome to another Geotech Hour. It is my honor to be joined today with a set of familiar friends from the Geotech Center and our recent AgriTech Action event. For those of you who were able to join us November 17th through the 19th, we held an AgriTech Action 3-day conference virtually, focusing on how data and technology can achieve a world in which everyone is fed sustainably. We recognize that agriculture and the global food system are experiencing disruption and can experience positive disruption if we think about people-centered approaches to employing new emerging technologies and data in ways that empower localities, but also global systems to work better, more effectively, and be more resilient, given not just what COVID-19 has demonstrated in terms of the fragility of systems, but other expected impacts that we'll see with climate change and other disruptions in the decade ahead. So it's with great honor that I welcome to the show our fellow friends, Daniela, Tammy, Nikhil, and Claire. Really glad to have you here. And I'm going to go first to Daniela, longtime friend of the Geotech Center and one of the co-organizers for AgriTech Action. What would be the key takeaways that you have on AgriTech Action and how we can work towards a global food system that is more secure, stable, and feeds the planet?
Well, first of all, hello, David, and hello to everyone else, not only online, but of course, Claire, Tammy, and Nikhil. Very nice to see all of you and be here. And thank you, David, for creating the platform that is the Geotech Center. I think for the first time, we were able to see agricultural technology and national security experts come together. And as a result, the discourse was noticeably more provocative and intelligent and got to the heart, I would say, of the thorny and complex issues in a very practical way. We had great panelists and we also had great audience participation as well. Many of my friends, and I spoke to them after the conference, who are renowned and seasoned agricultural professionals, even said that they were blown away by how much they learned. So trying to capture these 3 amazing days in one short response can be a little bit challenging, but I'll do my best. So briefly, first takeaway is we need more discussions like this. I don't want to go into another discussion where we sit around and talk about what we already know. Instead, we need to ask questions about what we don't know. So that's the first thing. And I think understanding what we don't know is the first step in building a proper risk model that includes heat mapping and an immune system for agriculture. Listening to Jeff Rowe speak, the global head of seed from Syngenta, we begin to appreciate how complicated farming and agriculture is, and how do you make seed and other inputs that specifically address unique geographical, climatic, and topographical conditions. And doing this while these conditions are constantly changing. So the first takeaway is technology will be able to respond faster than policy. Second takeaway in regard to data, there's a ton of data out there. However, we have to first work through data trust and privacy issues so that the generators of this data feel protected, and we can verify the accuracy of this data to ensure that our decisions based on this data are informed. And finally, we need to appreciate that agriculture from farm to fork is made up of for-profit businesses. And people don't go into agriculture to make money hand over fist, but at the same time, they need to remain solvent. So therefore, even though our goals should be aspirational, I would say our solutions cannot be, and the best solutions require the least amount of resources to create the maximum benefit.
Excellent. And I think, like you said, it's often challenging to encapsulate 3 days into a very short answer, but I think you gave a very succinct summary of both the path forward, and like you said, it's this linking of the disciplines of national security, thinking about public safety and stability, as well as data and tech as it relates to agriculture and global food. I think that's where we're trying to be provocateurs, because really, if there's anything that's happened over the last 2 to 3 decades, is we're seeing technologies that were only available to the national security communities of certain countries now increasingly become commercially available. I would ask you real quick, Danielle, as you post people that were at the event and takeaways, was there something where they were particularly excited for 2021, 2022? Was there something that you were hearing from them that they were particularly interested in things that had them excited about as we look towards the future for the next year or two ahead? Oh, There's a dog. Always good to have a dog. No worries.
Yeah, dog chose a great time to bark, but that's right, the reality of working from
You're
home.
just getting Zoom bombed by your own canine. That's okay. That
He has a
happens.
very strong opinion about your question and about the mailman. That's all
That
I can
happens.
say. I think to answer your question, they're excited about agriculture being a solution to climate change, not a cause or.
Wow, I really so one, kudos to your dog for helping trigger that response, and maybe he is enthusiastically agreeing at representing the canine species on the planet. How can agriculture be a solution to climate change? That is a very interesting question. So with that, Tammy, also welcome, longtime friend of the Geotech Center. Thank you for everything you've been doing as well. Maybe Daniela just teed it up for you. What were your biggest takeaways from AgriTech Action and how we can work forward to a global food?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Daniela, you almost stole my line. I think the overall effect of we covered so many issues in our session, particularly 3 key drivers on decarbonisation, on increasing efficiency of the food supply, production to consumption chain, and then particularly resilience in climate austere environments that are coming. But although some of this can sound quite negative, actually what came out, the overall takeaway was that the technology absolutely exists for us to enable how we tackle all 3 of these drivers, and that it's actually a very positive outcome that we can look at. We need to measure to give us that data, to give people that data, and that absolutely reflects what you just said, Daniela, which is that these types of conversations are very, very important, because people don't necessarily know what's out there yet, and what is actually already exists, and that's what these things do. So, a number of areas there, and I could go into further, but I'll go back to you there, David, to see if there's anything you want to pick up on particularly those key drivers.
Well, and you mentioned measure, and actually being able to understand what's out there and what's useful. And like you said, right now, if anything, it's trying to connect people that have different pieces of the puzzle. I guess I'd be interested, Daniela put forward the idea of making sure agriculture can be a solution to climate change. What are your thoughts about, we need to obviously first begin to measure what's happening and begin to measure what's possible. If you were to have exciting leads for 2021, 2022 that we might be able to do, what excites you the most there, Tammy?
So let's get into some specifics. I think one of the things that is really coming together and being measured, and this is one of the areas that Connectera, Yasu Kokera mentioned, is our ability to measure the entire food supply chain from production all the way through to consumption. And I think particularly, which area do you start with? But let's start with the production end, and agriculture and regenerative farming, for instance, but the ability to measure carbon emissions or other emissions, methane being another big one, in soil, for instance, just as the very, very start, because there's such a lot of soil degradation, which is, we are aware of now, but we also and many of these are actually old practices, of allowing fields to go fallow, but how to then use that in a very multi-purpose way. We have the means now to be able to measure that. It's arguably relatively still a little expensive, but like so many of these things, once you start to use them more and you roll it out, then absolutely it becomes much more normal. And we have to think about measuring not just in terms of just 1 year now, one production, but over a system of years, how can that be done? And of course, farmers then potentially could be paid for their farm's ability to be able to sequester that carbon. And that's a really powerful argument for farmers who for so long have been disempowered from this argument. And they are, quite frankly, some of the saviors of the climate change and climate crisis that is ongoing now.
I really like that, and maybe we even had a first here, Tammy, kudos to you, farming for carbon sequestration. I think we maybe have a tagline for pitching to certain policy leaders. So thank you for that, Tammy. I think there's a lot that you shared there that I think are ways forward concretely for 2021, and I look forward to seeing what we can do to help advance that. Would like to now also welcome Nikhil, longtime friend of the Geotech Center. I believe you are fellow 002, sorry, Julian being 001, but 002, Nikhil, with the license to kill as a Geotech fellow. you've done a lot of great thought about how we make sure we empower communities, how we actually uplift people using data and technology, and we avoid the downside. What are your biggest takeaways on AgriTech Action and how we can work forward to a better world?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I think Danielle and Tammy, I think you made some really good points that are specifically touching on what I was thinking about as well. And Tammy, at the end, you said farmers have been disempowered historically. And I think one of the really cool things about the AgriTech Action event was how basically the event tried to create a collaboration between people working on tech, people working in agriculture, people working in the nonprofit space and the policy space. And I think those four circles are absolutely critical, right, to make any form of change. And I thought the real key takeaway for me was kind of the idea that, like, I think when you traditionally think about tech innovation, right, if you think back to early 2000s, leading up to maybe 2010, 2015, a lot of tech innovation was primarily driven by urban centers. And it was very much kind of the assumption that tech in and of itself is good, right? Tech is good, and that will essentially trickle down. And you had a lot of companies, even kind of now up to this day, that have developed technology, but very much believe that their tech was good in itself. So they're like, we don't need to have a CSR group within our company, within our organization. It's whatever we're doing will proliferate out to everyone. But I think what was really great here is I think there were a number of organizations that are trying to be far more intentional and deliberate as far as how they're developing their technology, as well as implementation, right? And so in this case, it's making sure the designs themselves are effective, that they're user-friendly, but then really trying to understand what are the direct needs for people on the ground, for farmers, for communities, and not trying to just say, okay, we can just sit in the back and develop something and expect this to kind of solve everyone's problems. And I think that really lends itself well into kind of thinking about new models for innovation. And I think you can start thinking about more community-centered models rather than something that is centralized or done by one particular group. And that can kind of cover so many arrays, right? You can think about the technological design itself of something that allows for a more community-centered model, but then also that allows for another opportunity where public sector can also kind of look at what is the infrastructure developments that need to be done? What is the kind of the real underlying conditions that need to be addressed? And so I think you're able to cover a broad assortment of things, which I think we were able to cover quite well at the event.
Excellent, Nikhil. And I liked how you said it is about making sure we bring together the different stakeholders, that it's not any one community, it's about bringing them together. And then also pointing out that unfortunately, up until for the most recent era, technology has been mainly focusing on more on urban areas and really not thinking about what it can do for more rural and how to involve rural areas. And so you were talking a little bit about rethinking about how we make sure we involve the community in the process and maybe even change from customer relationship management to community relationship management. I guess, are there signs where you're seeing tech companies are being able to do this, or if you were to make recommendations to tech company, what would you recommend they do if they wanted to get more involved with empowering tech and new approaches and data approaches for rural areas? How would they get started?
Yeah, so I think one of the ways that I've seen at least is tech companies partnering with local communities on the ground. And I think that's absolutely critical, right? So you're working directly with local organizations, local associations, and really working with them and basically having them as stakeholders within the development. And I think that's something that we found that, and I think a few different panelists at the event spoke on. I think the other one too is some of the other things that we've seen is just more general kind of designs themselves that basically have it so that I think there's more decentralized technology. So we did talk, one panelist spoke about fintech opportunities, particularly with kind of crypto and decentralized finance. And a lot of those are kind of protocols and designs that entirely let people kind of have power over their own data and kind of their own initiatives rather than expecting and relying upon another entity to kind of manage it. And so I think those are kind of the two frameworks that we've seen that actually we're seeing a lot more of. And I think a lot more intentionality around that implementation itself.
Excellent, Nikhil. And I hope you're absolutely right that we see more intentionality in 2021, 2022. We've got to do more distributed, decentralized approaches that are with the communities we're trying to partner with, as opposed to doing it to them and not involving them until after the fact. So well said. So Claire, you have an enviable job of trying to do additional discussion on AgriTech Action after already having Daniela, Tammy, and Nikhil give great remarks. At the same time, you were one of the stars that helped make AgriTech Action happen. So I'd ask you, what are your biggest takeaways from the big event?
Well, as you said, Daniela, Tammy, and Nikhil already gave great summaries of the 3 days and really captured a lot of the spirit of the event, which was innovative and exciting and really fast-paced. So I'm really grateful for those conversations. And I would add that in addition to representation from a lot of different sectors like government and tech and nonprofit, there was also global representation, which I was really glad to see. We had people from all over the world, 3 different continents speaking and participating in the audience. And I think that's really important because we're facing the same challenges in every single country. They may look a little different, but food insecurity challenges and getting healthy produce to the right people, and this growing issue of climate change and how it's impacting farms and their production. We're all in the same boat. And so I think having conferences, continuing to have global conferences where we can learn from one another and seeing what's working in different areas of the world is really important. And then the second thing that I would just like to reinforce, because it's already been said, is that a lot of this technology already exists, and farms are already data powerhouses. They're collecting so much data. And so the gap is not really in making sure that they have the data, but in sense making and making sure that they are informed and can make decisions on agriculture and harvesting from that data. And secondly, that they can share it with other farms. And so that's the gap that I would really like to see filled. And that's really what I took away from those 3 days.
Excellent. And I really liked how you said, again, farms are already data powerhouses. They have the data, but can they make sense of it? Can they use it to drive decisions? Can they use it? I think that's so key, Claire. I would ask you one quick rejoinder, because I can remember when you and Daniela initially came and you pitched a 3-day conference and you had all the different topics, and I was like, wow, this is going to be big. What was the biggest thing that surprised you, or that you learned from, or that emerged out of the conference? Because you obviously had a plan when you came with that pitch, but what surprised you as a result of the conference?
Well, I was really glad to see that throughout each panel, the same types of issues came up. Even though we had themes for each day and each panel had a specific topic that we wanted to talk to, it continued to circle back to creating a profit for farmers, making sure that we have a business model that's sustainable for them, and then making sure that the food is healthy and that it gets to the right people. And so no matter, even if the conversation was on regenerative agriculture or on production and distribution and supply chains, we continued to circle back to some key things, which I think is really important, and it signals to what we should really point our energy to. So I'm glad that we started with a wide array of topics, but I really think it boiled down to a few key things, and that makes our job a lot easier going forward because we know what we need to focus on.
Excellent. Thank you, Claire. And again, thank you again for all that you did for a very impressive event. Really appreciate everything you did to help organize it. So now, Tammy, we've been talking about people and community-centered approaches. What has you the most excited about the data and tech that could improve agriculture?
So, particularly, again, with a bit that slant on the climate crisis that we are facing, I think the most exciting thing is really the ability for this data that is available to be available to the consumer, because it is consumer choices that are really going to make a massive difference. And it's not just knowledge. I think many people know that they should perhaps eat more plant-based food, or they should change their diet slightly. They should waste less food, but they're not quite sure what does that mean? How does that, when you buy a product, where does it come from? How can you make those choices? And so, we had, from Unilever, some fantastic insights into work that they're doing. They are going to decarbonize their entire production chain by, in the next 20 years, 2039, phenomenal. So, but to have that data available and to have kind of like smart metering, almost like a QR code on food, that would be amazing. That would be really amazing. And then people can actually make those choices.
Really, maybe to sort of dig on that a little bit more. So talking about a QR code for food, it would actually show where it came from and maybe the offsets that were involved with producing it. Could you tell me a little bit more about what is that QR code for food? That would be great.
Wow, a QR code for food. There's been some discussion of it, particularly I think it's been seen a little bit more around fish stocks and where do they come from, especially those that are endangered species, because of course biodiversity loss is a big piece. But it's not yet rolled out to everything, and this is where the measure data comes in. It's true, farms are data powerhouses in the global north. You know, one of the things that we discussed quite a bit of was you know, the global south and how does that data get rolled out there. So connecting that all together for something like a QR code, you know, is still a piece that needs to be put in place. So that is a piece that's upcoming, and the demand for that is growing now a lot. And of course, one of the things that gets a lot of criticism when it comes to the climate crisis is, oh, is this going to be job losses for all sorts of people? Well, actually, of course, data and technology is where there's absolute opportunities for jobs to be made. And again, that's very, very exciting too, with how that's going to figure into something as small as a QR code and how that can be useful.
Excellent. Thank you, Tammy. And I like also how you pointed out that this actually could be a net employer as opposed to either staying the same or something else. So Nikhil, you talked a little bit about crypto, but I'll ask you sort of whether you want to dive deeper into that or other technologies as well. Data and tech that might be able to improve agriculture. What has you the most excited?
Yeah, that's exactly it. The one that I was most excited about was kind of fintech and digital currency. The reason is, I think if you really think about traditional financial systems, right, it's particularly in more rural parts of the country and the world, and not only the United States, but other parts of the world, you essentially have a separation, right? The financial capital from traditional financial institutions has oftentimes not reached people very much on the ground. People historically marginalized, communities that have been who have been kind of have had violence inflicted upon them, whether it's genocide or refugees or minority communities, women as well. And so in that case, I think if you look at things around digital currency, there's a lot of opportunity to make financial systems more accessible as well as inclusive. And I think the real reason for that is you're trying to basically envision a world in which we're not reliant on traditional financial institutions, but we can say, no, like we can actually have alternates to that. So there's two facets to this, right? One is more central bank digital currencies, and that's created by governments. And that allows for money to be better able to reach people who normally can't get it. And I think that combined with greater access to internet works quite well as mobile banking allows people to have access to capital in a way they normally couldn't. And the second thing is even more traditional, kind of like not central bank digital currency, but more private sector cryptocurrencies, as well as decentralized finance. And the reason for that is I think there's just a lot more interest around saying, okay, great, we've had problems with our normal way that financial capital moves around the world and the way people have access to financial resources. And so in this case, we're able to say, what are the new mechanisms for that? And you're seeing also a lot of work on trying to create systems that can work in low bandwidth areas on easier to use cell phones. I think the common problem before was, oh, it only works on a really high-end smartphone. But now we're looking at a lot more efforts to say, no, let's try to have this on phones that work a lot better, and kind of lower end phones. And we're seeing a lot of that. And I think that's really interesting because it doesn't mean that people need to have a bank account. It doesn't mean people need to be right near a bank. It doesn't mean they need to be able to go to a financial institution to be able to borrow money, but they can start borrowing money within their community. They can access capital. They can make transactions. They can buy and sell directly to people.
So can I name you a special envoy to the Department of Agriculture to liaise with the Department of Treasury? That is a very compelling, we need to capture that, Nikhil, because I think what you just shared there is a very compelling proposition, and we need to get it in front of as many people as possible. So I really appreciate that, Nikhil. Thank you. So Claire, what excites you in terms of data and technology and improving agriculture?
Well, I am really excited about precision agriculture. The more that I learn about the capabilities of farmers to make decisions based on individual plants or square feet on their ground, I think is pretty incredible. And it goes along with improving the nutritional output of farms, because that's really what I care about and focus on a lot, is how we're going to increase the nutritional content of food all around the world. And I think that precision agriculture, but also this revolution of seed, is going to be a really important part of that. So I'm glad that we had that conversation with Jeff Rowe to talk about how increasing technology and research for seeds is going to be crucial. And then optimizing the pesticide application and the harvesting of food so that it is as healthy as it can possibly be, I think is great, because that is a key solution to the amount of money and effort that's being spent on diet-related diseases right now. And so I think that I'm really excited by all of the innovations that are going into agriculture, because I see it having a direct impact on the money we're spending. I think it's like $190 billion a year in the United States on obesity and its related diseases. And so I think that I'm glad to see that it's going to have impacts beyond agriculture itself. It's really going to change human health. And I think it's important that both medicine and agriculture can see those overlaps.
And I really like the view that you're sharing, that we do need to think thinking about the overlaps of human health and medicine. And I saw a recent statistic that says med schools now are down to less than 25 hours in the entire med school experience are spent on nutrition. So I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts, Claire, about if doctors were to be made more aware of how does agriculture, nutrition impact health, what would you design as a curriculum for that?
Yeah, that statistic is pretty scary, but the trend is already happening. I mean, doctors are already more aware and more interested in food as medicine, and that's in part motivated by the patients and their desire to understand how food impacts their health and can help cure their diseases, especially long-term ones. And so I've already seen programs like healthy food prescriptions where the doctor can prescribe fresh produce and it's paid for by insurance. Or where doctors, I was reading a really good article about how doctors would spend times in grocery stores near produce sections and help guide customers who are having trouble changing their diets, especially for children. It can be really difficult to kind of increase healthy food and start those habits young. And so I think the trend is already happening and it's really great to see. And I think that technology can be a part of that as well, because all of these apps and information online about nutrition is going to really empower patients. But it also means that it has to be accurate. And so that brings up a couple more challenges as well. But overall, I think we're moving more towards nutrition being integrated into healthcare.
Excellent. I hope med schools are listening to you. I appreciate that, Claire. So Daniela, what has you most excited about data and tech and improving agriculture as well?
Well, I have to echo much of what Claire and Tammy and Nikhil already said, and for reasons too numerous for time to mention. But I think one of the things that all of those things that they mentioned have in common is what I like, which are solutions that follow the 2 + 2 = 5 model. And what I mean by that is by addressing a defined problem in a strategic and, as Tammy says, measurable way, we're able to easily apply it and get success and replicate the solution to addressing other problems, therefore creating exponential value. So some examples that I heard, Andy Mack, who's also a senior fellow, the CEO and founder of Agrimobile, for example, who's developing a technology and an app that helps address, marketing issues for smaller farmers, making them more profitable, which helps them get more access to credit and do better, but it also helps address food waste. With regard to nutrition, we heard from Eric Tribe, which I think their business model is just absolutely phenomenal in Flash Foods. So grocers normally make 1% to 3% profit, and they have to actually get rid of a lot of food, throw it out when it's about to reach its maximum shelf life, and then they have to also pay to dispose that. And what they do is really pretty simple. They put it on the web at 50% off, but they have so many metrics around there, not only to show increased profitability, which helps replicate this in other grocers and say, hey, this is a good idea for our business model, but it also demonstrates that people have greater access within the community to nutritious foods, and they're eating more fresh fruits and vegetables as a result. We also heard from Glenn Jordan, who's the CEO for BitProp, and I love what his company was doing and featured in a major article in The Economist, which is a problem that occurs, I don't want to say uniquely in Africa, but they're addressing in Africa and also in the developing world, where unlike in the United States, where you don't have a deed to land, it's handed down generation to generation, but that prevents you from getting credit and expanding your resources and access to technology. So doing the aerial mapping and getting acceptance that that land indeed does belong to that particular farmer helps that person a lot. So all of these are pretty simple, but very effective solutions. And when they're effective, they get replicated.
I really like how you said, again, effective solutions. And again, the ones that are looking for that more than an additive growth, that it's a win-win, but it's a win-win plus a little bit more. So Danielle, if you were to make a recommendation to the Department of Agriculture next year to assemble these different tech companies and actually think about how we could do things better, what would be a recommendation to sort of serve as a driving force? So it's not just show and tell, because show and tell you can do, but we're really looking for solutions. How might you bring them together to actually be focused on solutions that actually can move things forward in 2021 and beyond?
Well, okay, so there are two different models to farming. There's, and I'm putting this very generally, okay? There's a big farm, there's a small farm, totally different issues. My concern is a concern that's not just related to agriculture, but it's also related writ large. We have 2,000 rural counties, and Nikhil started hitting on this quite a bit, that don't have access. They can't even consider building these things out, these systems out, because they don't have access to very basic things like technology, which prevents them from having access to healthcare and from ensuring, for example, that they have an education and access to fresh foods. So all of these things, I think we first and foremost need to recognize that there's a huge disparity there, and we need to address that first. At the same time, on the large side, for large businesses in the agricultural industry, including large-scale farms, they're going to be driving the innovation. So we need to make sure that they don't have any impediments. And right now, we definitely have a problem, and I think it centers around misinformation, disinformation around food, where some of these companies are thinking twice about investing.
In the sense, making all the AI in the world doesn't matter. So 10 points to you for that. So Tammy, I'm going to actually ask you, we've had conversations about climate and thinking about food. We've talked a little bit, and it hasn't come out here yet, but we've talked in the past about using space-based observations or observations from space to make sense of the world. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about what's possibly new in that approach, and how could observations from space both help us address climate change, but also help us address making food and agriculture better too?
Yeah, space. I mean, that is the new frontier, right? I mean, there is so much now that we are able to do through tech, and data, and the ability to be able to see things at scale, and that's, I think, where space really comes in. The kind of the geospatial sensing and mapping, and our ability to be able to connect that. Then it makes a big difference. So this is part of the piece then with measuring soil and carbon, emission, is where can we see that there are, carbon hotspots or different types of gas hotspots, and what does that mean, and how is that affected over time, which is really important. And I think these are some of the things that we are starting to be able to see now. I mean, with COVID-19, there has been a sharp drop in carbon emissions over this year, and as we know, a lot of carbon emissions come from the food industry and agriculture. Arguably a third of a household's emissions is from from their food intake and production and wastage. But that is actually a tiny drop in the amount of carbon and greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere overall. And that's where the space and technology side is able to measure that. And we, of course, we have to be careful about measurement and what we're measuring and how we make sense of that. But as we move forward on that, we can have that kind of mapping which empowers us and connects the small, tiny farmer and the smaller people with that bigger piece. So there's a lot going forward there, and that's where it's difficult to know at the moment whether often it's the military that's moving forward with these great technologies. I'm not sure that's so much the case anymore these days. It's often actually industry and maybe even the drive in farming and food security that will move that forward.
Well said, and I think you hit the nail on the head too, is oftentimes now we're seeing commercial capabilities that actually are moving a little bit faster than what we typically saw in the past from military or national security communities. And so I'm not to put you on the spot, but let's say a large foundation approached you, Tammy, and they said, we want to hear your pitch for something we could do involving both the US and China, involving food and possibly some of these technologies. And I know we've talked about, you have this wonderful phrase, Tammy, of great power collaboration. So if you were approached by a magical foundation that was asking for your pitch about what might be something the US and China could do collaboratively in the area of climate change and agriculture, what might be a pitch that you might make to them?
So I think there really it has to be about how climate data and security all come together. Yeah. We import, many global north countries import about a third of their food, and they waste about a third of their food. And that food comes from somewhere. And that food often comes from the global north, from the global south. And I think one of the things we need to look at is the interconnectivity or the intersectionality of all of these issues. And what we don't want is for food security to become a cause or a driver of conflict. And I think that's where there's some real great power collaboration to be had, particularly along the Belt and Road Initiative, by China in Africa, where there are some enormous climate crises, issues to deal with. So that would be my pitch for sure.
That's a great pitch. And I particularly liked how you said the last thing we want is for food security to become a source of conflict. And like you said, thinking about the Belt and Road, thinking about what's happening in Africa, that would seem to be an area key for collaboration together on. So thank you, Tammy, for that. So Daniela, I'm going to turn to you and also ask what's new with your approaches. I'm going to pull out, though, because you said it a little bit, and I think it's worth examining a little bit more. You said there is misinformation, disinformation in the agriculture space. And so one, maybe if you could actually sort of maybe share a little bit about what is the extent of that issue, and then maybe how you think we might be able to address it. How can we actually deal with the fact that, I mean, just like unfortunately almost everything we're seeing nowadays, including the COVID-19 pandemic, there is misinformation, but what is it in terms of agriculture and global food?
Well, I mean, the elephant in the room is regarding, genetic technology, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and now genetic engineering. And it's fascinating for me because I follow this really closely, and I have for many years. We've known about it for a long time. So one of the things that we have to take into consideration, any decision we make, whenever we do something good, there are going to be people that are going to try to take that down.
Really? No, it never happens.
Right? So, people very often say to me, well, hey, I don't support this or I don't support that because, look at who's behind it. It's like, well, anything that matters, you're going to have bad actors involved. It's like, mosques going to light or flies to something else. So I think you and I have discussed this, and I actually asked you the same question, and I think having paneled many people, your response was the best one, which is you have to predict in advance where you think that these issues are going to be. It's kind of like I was talking to a friend of mine about cybersecurity. Where they're going to attack, where you're going to have ransomware attacks. It's going to be the ones that have the most to lose. Mm-hmm. So anticipating what the actions are going to be surrounding technology, we know that they're going to be bad actors when it comes to data privacy, data security. And letting people know beforehand and preparing and expecting it, not being ostriches with their head stuck in the ground saying, if we don't think about it, it won't happen. I do have to say, building on what others have said, is we need to be kind of blunt, if I may speak bluntly with you and others, about what is necessary. I think, you can't put a car on the road without a car. We need to once and for all address the disparity in these rural areas. There's none such as underprivileged as rural underprivileged. And we need to start addressing those areas, not just because it makes good sense and it's the right thing to do, but they represent deserts. And if we don't do it, someone else does. And one of the things that happened in the agricultural industry, and Richard Levick mentioned this too in our interview, is there was chatter for years that was kind of anti-GMO, that was percolating through various sources that was not paid attention to. And as a result, it got steam, it turned into life of its own. I'm seeing the same thing right now. One of the pieces of chatter, and I don't want to take up too much time, that I'm hearing a lot about is anti-big ag, anti-big seed. I say this as someone whose background is in business and finance. The seed industry doesn't have any of the hallmarks of a monopoly, and it doesn't function that way. There's competition, there's innovation. So as long as there's competition and innovation, we want to be supportive of the business model. So I hope that response.
Oh, it's very helpful. No, I think, as in speaking bluntly is great. And I think actually this is the time to actually highlight areas that we need to address. So on that then, and I think you've put forward, like you said, that we have a huge responsibility to the impoverished rural agricultural areas that have not seen the uplift or not seen the way forward. Do you, I guess, having, you've done things both in the private sector and also served in government, do you think, how do we begin to uplift him? I mean, if you were to give, like, if you were asked, what's your 2 to 3 minute elevator pitch to uplift him, what would that be, Danielle? I'd be interested in that.
Well, we go back to Maslow's hierarchy. I mean, first we need to, I actually think we need to heat map the United States and look at areas where first and foremost you have food deserts, where you have information deserts, where you have healthcare deserts, because where you have connectivity deserts, which is pretty much the predicate to all of these other things. And I don't just say this as some type of East Coast elite having this discussion. I've talked to a lot of people in rural America, and most recently, one of my best friends from childhood, who is a doctor working on COVID issues in very, very rural America. And listening, to them and making sure that they have a seat at the table, because, we're talking about, again, going back to business models, what is practicable? We need to make sure when we're devising solutions that they make sense. And sometimes what they say makes sense may not make sense to us, but they're boots on the ground and they understand what's actually going on. So if it were me, we do have dedicated funds, through FCC and through USDA as well, Farm Bill going towards rural connectivity, but it's just not enough. We need to redistribute some of our subsidies to go specifically toward, getting people up to speed. That way they can get, be on par when it comes to education, when it comes to food, when it comes to connectivity, so we can make best use of that data, have the right data, all of those things. That is the predicate.
Very well said, and I agree. It's making sure that we need to get the right funds to the folks that need them. And like you said, it may be the summer going there, but it's not enough. It's woefully insufficient. And Nikhil, if I recall, you're actually currently in Alabama at the moment. You've been there and you've been working the ground, and you've been also, like you said, a strong advocate of what Daniela said about boots on the ground. One of the things that you've written with the Atlantic Council on is making sure that data is not used against already marginalized communities. And so thinking from a risk perspective, but also from what we can do in terms of good, how might we make sure we avoid the pitfalls of data being weaponized, and at the same time think about how it can be good for the local communities?
Yeah, and I think a lot of this actually touches on almost explicitly from what Daniela was talking about. I think if you think about the weaponization of data, right, it comes from historical precedent. It's not there from nowhere. It's coming from some amount of history. So if we look in places like Alabama, if you look, for example, in the criminal justice system, and more broadly across the United States, and you try to look at data on crime, it's intricately and intimately tied to racism in the country. And so similarly, I think if you're considering data from that aspect and how to weaponize, it's because it's built on a history of some form of marginalization that is then being represented in the data that's being used. And we as society are actively choosing to use that data and using it to interpret certain things. Because at the end of the day, we can say this data set is flawed, or this data set actually shows something that is going wrong systemically, or we can say, oh, this data represents something that is true. And we have a choice on how we're using it. And so I think it really comes down to us determining how we want to use that data. If the data is in the purpose and in the service of empowering communities, and to some extent, really getting out of communities' ways, I think at the end of the day, data is weaponized. And what that means is you're just creating new and existing forms of oppression. And rather than saying, oh, we should be moving away from it. So actually, my argument would actually be in some of these cases, I think actually we just shouldn't look to data to be our savior. At the end of the day, we should be looking at understanding what are the things that we ourselves have created. And I think Daniela really touched on the idea of like looking at where money is flowing to, right? So I also grew up in a pretty rural part of the country, and capital doesn't flow in, right? Capital only flows out. Any resources only flow out. Very little goes in. And I think that's something we really need to think about is at the end of the day, what is the system that we've created? Where are the resources driving? Because that's what is going to be represented in data. And we need to rethink that and rethink how we are allocating capital accordingly.
I really liked how you said that, one, exactly, we definitely can't look to data to be our savior, but then two, you talked about capital flows, and that in a lot of places, capital flows only go out. We may also be seeing a lot of places only data goes out too. It's being hoovered up, but there's nothing of value being produced for the local area. I guess, are you seeing in what you've been doing in Alabama and the work that you've been doing, are you seeing things that give you hope? Are there models that you think that we should say we need to try and explore and do more of them? What gives you hope, and what might be ways forward that we can think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I couldn't be here if I wasn't hopeful. So I'll intro with that. But I think it is a long process, right? And I think it's very easy to have setbacks throughout. And so it's very much one of those things you can't really take any any improvement for granted, and you can't expect that to necessarily remain. And I think a lot of it kind of stems from the fact of like, once you do make a change, it's how can you institutionalize that and keep it in place. And so in my case, working on criminal justice reform work, really thinking about what are the policies that are in place, but then how do you make sure that those are sustained moving forward? And I think a lot of that does come down to not only is it the policy change, but I think people also need to understand, I think particularly people in power who do have access to resources, who are the ones responsible for enacting policy change, to understand why is it that those are the things that should be changed, and really kind of disentangling from society what are those problems that we've kind of put in place. And so I am absolutely hopeful, but it's a long game that obviously won't be solved. And I don't think we can be arrogant about it being solved anytime soon. I think a lot of these things are going to be things that have to be solved over time. And it's not only just one aspect, right? It might be that we've solved one thing, but that's obviously created 5 other branches that we then have to also tease out and deal with. And so I think we have to be very deliberate about each of those things. And there's a place arguably for everything and for everyone. And I think it's really thinking about, not only should there only be certain people focusing on it. At the end of the day, this isn't just a public sector issue or a nonprofit issue where nonprofits should be focusing on it. It should be very much people in private sector should also be thinking deeply about these questions and examining the business models they're using, the organizational practices they have. And I think if we do move towards that, I think then we'll start seeing a movement away from, I think that is the way we'll start seeing a movement away from more weaponized data.
Very well said. And I really appreciate that, Nikhil. And like you said, this is not a niche one person gets to solve or one community gets to solve. This is all of us. We are the cavalry. We have to be involved. All right, so we're now shifting to the lightning round, although we have a little bit more than just tweet links recommendations. I'm going to ask 2-part question. First, I'm going to go to each of you and I'm going to ask, you are an influential world leader. Maybe you're the new incoming president. Maybe you're the new incoming prime minister, whatever it might be. But what would be things that you would want to tackle in 2021, 2022? And then the second part is, for your tweet links recommendations, what are 2 or 3 milestones for the way forward? So Claire, let's say you are approached to actually make recommendations for what we do in the United States or what we do globally in 2021, 2022. What would you recommend? And then what would be your milestones for success?
Well, I think that in addition to the conversations we're having on uplifting rural communities, I have to call out specifically uplifting Native American communities and reservations because they have specific, unique challenges that are pertinent only to them. And specifically with food insecurity, they are like 400% more likely to experience food insecurity than the average US household. So I think the next administration needs to put those issues at the forefront, not only because that's wrong, they're so much more likely to experience that, but also because Indigenous communities are the original holders of the knowledge of how to get food sustainably. And so when we're going to have conversations about regenerative agriculture, I think that Indigenous leaders and farmers have to be at the forefront of that, and they have to have a platform in order to be able to give that knowledge, and we have to learn from them. I mean, we saw that in the California fires. People said, there was an NPR article about how controlled burning, which is an Indigenous tactic for agriculture, may actually have prevented widespread wildfires. So I think we need to recognize those mistakes and give Indigenous leaders a better platform. And I think that's going to change a lot of how the US administration is successful in increasing regenerative agriculture, but also decreasing food security.
Excellent. Thank you again, Claire. Really appreciate that. And that is a very important note that you highlighted, that we need to think about our Native American colleagues and making sure that they do not have what is essentially unfair. They have disproportionately more food insecurity relative to the rest of the nation. Nikhil, I meant it when I said I really think you should be a special advisor to both the Department of Treasury and the Department of Agriculture. But if you were to make recommendations in this area for 2021, 2022, what would they be? And then what would the milestones for success look like if we moved forward?
Yeah, also I want to give a shout out. I think, Claire, that was really, really good on Indigenous communities as well. I was thinking about that earlier as well. I think in terms of what we need to look at is, at least the thing that I'm particularly most interested in is income inequality, particularly in the United States, given that I'm an American. And thinking about the fact that, you know, we've kind of assumed that over time, this will just kind of correct itself. And it's not. We've seen that with COVID, right? Indigenous communities have not caught up after kind of genocidal violence from them inflicted against them when it comes to Trail of Tears, relocation, things like that. We have not seen it for, broadly speaking, for minority communities, Black, Latinx. And there's been an assumption that it will. And I think we need to think, my recommendation really would be, we need to really, really start allocating capital specifically for that. We should be allocating capital really to public institutions for the purpose of that, whether that's healthcare, whether that's housing in urban places, whether that is agriculture. And I think it's, broadly speaking, a complete transformation from the way we're thinking about where we're sending money and how we're funding. And so that would be my primary thought on that. And my recommendation and my tweet length would be basically, we need to rethink the way we're running government for that.
Oh, I think that is spot on. And in fact, that is part and parcel of one of the core pillars of the Geotech Center, is thinking about how we govern better at a speed and scale that is basically unprecedented. And we're using the word govern, recognizing that's going to involve government, but it may also involve community partners, corporate partners, and things like that. So very well said, Nikhil. So Tammy, as we wrap things up in the lightning round, maybe in some respects, Nikhil put it forward to you in terms of thinking about how we actually address doing things differently, let's say now globally, and making sure that we don't see the inequalities that we have. He mentioned this idea of housing. He mentioned this idea of finance. In some respects, these are all things that could be abundant, that we could have housing available abundantly, food could be abundantly as well. And we know in some respects from military, when things are abundant, they're less likely to be fought over as well. So maybe if you could riff a little bit about how we could work towards a global agenda of abundance and how that can maybe actually be something that actually uplifts everybody.
That is a tall order, David.
Especially in like 5 minutes.
But hey, here goes. You know, I think in order to meet that kind of global agenda and to, you know, the markers that are down on the ground are the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, they have been set a while ago and they are coming up for, you know, 2030, and we have less than 10 years to get there. It is very clear what those things are. And for the next administration, absolutely making sure all of those things are looked at is really important. And going back to intersectionality, you know, I'll mention Shelley Koch's book on food and gender. You know, it's often women in these indigenous communities or in other ethnicities or in the global south who are the ones that, you know, suffer the most from this. Again, when there is conflict, it is the same issue. And we have the opportunity through food, because so much of the food sector and the farming sector is in fact actually conducted by women, invisible women, as the recent book title goes. So these are the areas really to concentrate on, as we move forward, is to ensure that we have that inclusivity and to empower those women. So I think that's where, from a tweet perspective, I would say, we need to measure, get that data available, empower those disenfranchised and smaller communities, and then scale up that connectivity to bring all those small people and data points together.
Well done, Tammy. You rose, not only did you rise to the occasion, you went far beyond it. I think you actually put forward the at least the initial manifesto we need to have for AgriTech Action in 2021. So thank you for that, Tammy. Of course, you just made it all that harder for Daniela to bring it home for us. So Daniela, now, what would be your recommendations for the world as we look to 2021, 2022? And then what would be your tweet links, milestones of success as we move forward?
4 quick recommendations. I just added one based on those great answers by Tammy, Claire, and Nikhil, which have a common thread. We need diversity in agriculture. And let's do another forum just on diversity in agriculture. So that's the first one. Second one, and I say this as a former regulator, I spent years in government. We need a floor when it comes to regulation. Anything above and beyond that, we have one in Europe, we have one in the United States and developed countries. Anything above and beyond that, we should follow what I would consider the Energy Star model. Energy Star was a voluntary program by EPA that was incredibly successful at moving the needle. And changing the entire industry. So incubating programs like that and then selling them off into the private sector once we get them going. Number two, we need good and accurate data on what's being planted and grown. We need good and accurate data on connectivity. We still don't have any good maps on connectivity. And finally, there are 2,000 rural counties in the United States that are vulnerable to food insecurity, healthcare insecurity, education insecurity, and lack of access to good information. As a country, we're only as strong as our weakest links.
Very well said. And like you said, it's all of us together. If we have weak links, it impacts us all, both for our country and for the world. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you, Claire. This has been a very exciting Geotech Hour. I appreciate it. I will also call out for our audience, we will include on the Geotech website. So if you visit the Geotech website in the next few days, we'll include illustrations that are takeaways from AgriTech Action as well. So you'll be able to see those on the website. Please join us for the next Geotech Hour on Wednesday, December 9th, as well as December 16th, 12 noon Eastern, for some exciting conversations. Again, thank you, Tammy, Nikhil, Claire, and Daniela. You've been amazing, and I hope you continue to be bold, be brave, and be benevolent. See you next time.